The United Space Exploration Agency was in chaos. The screens were filled with flashing red alerts, and the voice of Commander Hayes crackled through the communication system, sharp and strained. The Ether 5 is spiraling into the black hole. We've lost communication. All personnel, prepare for impact. Avon Foster, the only person in the room who seemed unfazed by the emergency, glanced up from his station. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his lips. As the rest of the crew scrambled to contain the panic, Avon sat back in his chair, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table in front of him. "Calm down, folks. It's just a black hole," he said dryly, as if addressing an audience. "I mean, what could possibly go wrong?" The room fell silent for a moment before the shrill beep of the control panel pierced the air again. The Ether 5, an advanced scientific vessel carrying cutting-edge research, was now within the event horizon. Beyond that point, there was no return. In that single, heart-stopping moment, Avon realized something crucial. The Ether 5 was not just a spaceship, it was a repository of irreplaceable data. Data that, if lost to the black hole, could set back humanity's understanding of antimatter energy by decades, if not longer. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about the future of human knowledge. He stood up abruptly, his usual self-assured demeanor slipping into something more determined, almost reckless. "Commander," Avon spoke, his voice steady despite the chaos, "I'm the only one who can go in after them." There was a pause, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Avon was the only person alive who could interact with antimatter, an ability he had accidentally developed after a series of botched experiments. It was a strange power, one that made him a kind of living conduit for antimatter particles. But it was also a dangerous power. The more he used it, the faster his body decayed, as if the antimatter were slowly eating him from the inside out. Commander Hayes, who had known Avon long enough to understand his odd mix of confidence and self-destructive tendencies, hesitated. "Avon, this isn't just a mission, it's a suicide run. The black hole's gravitational pull is stronger than anything we've ever encountered. It could pull you into oblivion," Avon finished for her, his voice light. Yeah. I've read the manuals. But you need someone with with antimatter, don't you? Trust me, Commander, I've got this." Before she could argue further, Avon was already heading for the transport bay, his mind already working in overdrive. The gravity of the situation hadn't quite hit him yet. For now, he was focused only on one thing: rescuing the crew, recovering the data, and, above all, getting out of this mess alive. He suited up quickly, the pressure suit tight around his frame. It was a familiar feeling, like slipping into armor. The difference was, this suit wouldn't save him if something went wrong. But Avon had come to terms with that. He always had. The suit's internal systems flickered to life as the transport ship lifted off, but Avon's mind was elsewhere. He focused on his connection to antimatter, the energy flowing through his body, the strange hum it made in his blood. "Last chance to back out, Foster," his co-pilot, Dr. Valeria Hayes, no relation to the commander, said from the cockpit, her voice tinged with anxiety. "Once we enter the event horizon, there's no telling what'll happen to us." Avon smiled, eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "Oh, I'm not backing out. In fact, I'm just getting started." The journey toward the black hole was eerily calm. The transport ship, built for quick escapes, sped toward the edge of the abyss, the immense gravitational pull of the black hole distorting space around them. Avon could feel the pull, the sensation of being drawn into something much larger than himself. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, like walking toward the mouth of a great beast, feeling it breathe, its hunger palpable. As they neared the event horizon, time itself began to warp. Avon noticed the ship's controls glitching, as though space itself was folding in on itself. The stars outside seemed to elongate, stretching like liquid as the ship crossed into the shadow of the black hole. Avon exhaled slowly, then turned to Valeria. "This is the part where we all get really freaked out, right? Valeria's hand was trembling as she worked the controls. I think we're well beyond freaked out now, Avon. You're the only one who can survive in there. We're going to be your eyes and ears. Don't make me come in after you. Noted, Avon replied. But I'm not planning on making it easy for you. The Ether 5 was a wreck, floating lifelessly within the grip of the black hole. Its lights flickered weakly, its hull strained from the immense pressure. As Avon docked with the ship, he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment that would define his career, his life, and possibly his legacy. All right, let's do this, Avon muttered to himself as he donned his helmet. He activated his antimatter abilities, feeling the familiar surge of power coursing through his veins, just as his body began to unravel beneath the strain. His hand reached out to the control panel as he boarded the ship. Inside, the crew was alive, barely. They were in a state of shock, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with terror. They had been exposed to the black hole's unique energy fields for hours, their bodies ravaged by the constant bombardment of antimatter radiation. Everyone, stay calm, Avon said, though his voice barely masked his own unease. We're getting out of here. As Avon worked to stabilize the ship, his mind raced. He could feel the power of the antimatter flooding through him, amplifying his strength, but it was also eating away at him. The sensation of his cells deteriorating was almost impossible to ignore. His skin prickled, and he could feel his organs shifting within him as if they were slowly being pulled apart. Keep moving, Foster, he muttered under his breath, shaking off the dizziness that was threatening to overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not now, not when the crew's lives were hanging in the balance. Focus on the data, focus on the mission. But the data wasn't just about saving the crew. It was about something far more valuable. Hidden within the Ether 5's core was information on a new form of antimatter energy, something that could provide a limitless source of power for humanity. If Avon could just extract that data, he would have saved more than just the crew. He would have saved the future. He paused for a moment, staring at the screens in front of him. The data was intact. It was all there, but as the antimatter energy pulsed through him, Avon felt a strange sensation, a pressure in his chest, a feeling of being torn in two. His body wasn't meant to handle this much energy. Every second inside the black hole was pushing him further to the edge of collapse. Avon continued to push the ship's systems to their limits, his fingers dancing over the controls. The antimatter was pulsing within him, a heavy, alien presence that made his heart race and his bones ache. He could feel his body reacting to it, the subtle disintegration of his cells, the gnawing sensation as his skin began to crack and peel, as though the energy was consuming him from the inside out. The fact that he was still standing, still functioning, was a miracle in itself. But miracles didn't last forever. Focus, Avon muttered to himself, the words barely audible above the low hum of the ship's failing systems. His hands trembled slightly as he worked to stabilize the ship's antimatter generator, aware that time was running out. Every second inside the black hole was another second closer to his body being completely ravaged. If he didn't hurry, if he didn't get the crew and the data out of here, it wouldn't matter how much energy he had. There would be nothing left of him. The crew members were scattered throughout the ship, pale and haggard, their eyes wide with exhaustion and disbelief. They had been in the black hole's grip for far longer than they should have been, their bodies already showing signs of the extreme strain. Some of them could barely stand, let alone assist with the repairs. Avon couldn't blame them. He felt like he was a step away from becoming part of the ship himself, his own atoms slowly dissolving into the fabric of space. But despite the overwhelming odds, Avon couldn't help but crack a grin as he moved through the ship. This was what he was born for, being the person everyone turned to in a crisis, the one who did the impossible. Sure, the black hole might kill him, but not today. Not if he had anything to say about it. Hang on tight, Avon called over his shoulder to the crew, forcing his voice to sound calm. We're not done yet. He moved quickly through the vessel, every movement a careful calculation. Each jolt of the ship, each distortion of space, made his body feel like it was being stretched thinner. His muscles, already strained, began to cramp, and his head throbbed as the antimatter tore through him. His senses were on overload. Colors flickered around the edges of his vision, and sounds became distorted, like they were coming from far away. It was like walking through a nightmare where nothing was real, where time and space didn't behave the way they were supposed to. His mind was swimming in a sea of equations and theories, trying to piece together a plan. They needed to escape, and the only way to do that was to use the antimatter inside him, to fuel the ship's engines with the very energy that was killing him. But that was a risky proposition. It would take everything he had, and then some. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the unmistakable sense of a final decision approaching, one that would decide the fate of everyone on board. Data secure, Avon called out, his voice rising slightly as he spoke into the comms. We've got what we came for. Now let's get out of here. The crew members, some of whom had been too weak to speak before, managed to nod, their faces filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. They didn't fully understand what Avon was about to do, but they didn't have the strength to argue either. Avon's mind, however, was already several steps ahead. He could feel the antimatter in his body, an ever-growing pressure that was slowly but surely reaching the point where it would rupture his very cells. His skin felt tight, as if the very molecules inside him were threatening to tear free. The pull of the black hole was growing stronger, and the energy he had been absorbing was beginning to destabilize. He knew he didn't have much time left, but then, as if by some cosmic miracle, a new voice crackled through the comms. Avon. He froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Avon, can you hear me? The voice repeated, more insistent now. Avon's breath caught in his throat. Valeria, he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears, the pounding rhythm of his pulse as he waited for the next words to come. I'm here, Avon. I've been monitoring your signal. Valeria's voice came through, steady and calm. I've been tracking your progress. You're not alone. Avon's mind raced. How could she be here? How was she able to communicate through the black hole's distortion? It didn't make sense, none of it made sense, but Valeria's presence, her voice, was like a beacon cutting through the darkness. It gave him a momentary sense of clarity, something to hold on to. Valeria, Avon started, but his words faltered as his body responded violently to the strain of the antimatter coursing through him. His legs gave out beneath him, and he staggered, clutching at the walls to steady himself. Pain shot through his chest, his lungs constricting as though they were being squeezed by the black hole itself. Avon, listen to me. Valeria's voice was sharp now, focused. You've got to control it. You can't let the antimatter take over. If you do, it'll consume you completely. You need to stabilize, Avon. Stabilize? Easier said than done. The pressure inside him was mounting, pushing against his bones and flesh, threatening to burst him open from the inside. Avon took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself, trying to block out the pain long enough to think clearly. But the words Valeria spoke, stabilize, were like a lifeline. He wasn't alone. Not completely. He had to hold on. He had to survive. He reached out again, gripping the controls of the ship with trembling hands. His vision blurred as he struggled to push the antimatter energy back into the ship's engines, trying to harness it in a controlled burst, a calculated release that would give them the momentum to escape, but the antimatter was a living thing, a chaotic force that wouldn't be tamed. Every time he tried to control it, it pushed back harder, eating away at his insides, unrelenting and wild. Come on, Avon muttered through gritted teeth, his hands slick with sweat. He could feel his body shaking, his muscles giving way to the strain. He had to force the energy into a stable form. He had to. In that moment, as he focused everything he had on the task at hand, he felt something shift within him. The antimatter, the wild, destructive force that had been consuming him, began to bend to his will. Slowly at first, and then with increasing certainty. It wasn't just power anymore. It was a tool, an instrument he could use, and as it flowed through him, he felt the connection, deep and terrifying, become clearer. He wasn't just reacting to the antimatter, he was controlling it. He pushed the energy into the ship's core with a burst of raw will, feeling the release of power surge through him, through the ship. The Ether 5 lurched forward, its engines sputtering to life, its hull vibrating with the intensity of the energy Avon had unleashed. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the ship's engines roaring to life, the ship beginning to break free of the black hole's grasp. But as the antimatter pushed outward, Avon felt himself slipping, his body finally giving in to the forces it could no longer withstand. His vision blurred, the edges of reality warping as he was engulfed in a torrent of energy. "Hang on," he whispered, as if the words could hold back the inevitable. He was barely conscious now, barely aware of the ship's movements, but he felt the pull of the escape. He had done it. He had saved them. The last thing he heard before everything went dark was Valeria's voice, faint but clear. "You did it, Avon. We're going to make it." Avon's world was fading fast, the edges of his consciousness blurring into a sickening haze. The overwhelming pressure of antimatter, the force he'd controlled with everything he had left, had reached its peak and then snapped. His body, battered and strained beyond any reasonable limit, could no longer hold itself together. His muscles, his organs, his very cells had begun to disintegrate under the weight of it all, but as he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, there was a strange, almost calming sensation that washed over him. The ship was moving. No, it was more than moving. It was escaping. The Ether 5 was no longer at the mercy of the black hole's pull. The moment he'd worked toward, struggled toward, had finally arrived. They were out. The escape was happening. He had done it. The moment of relief didn't last long. Avon's body rebelled against the sudden shift. The pain from the energy burst was gnawing at him, and he could feel his physical form unraveling, breaking down at an alarming rate. He could feel it in the twitch of his fingers, in the way his body felt as if it was going to collapse in on itself, like a hollow shell ready to fall apart. His thoughts were slow, sluggish, his mind unable to focus for more than a few seconds at a time. It was as if his body was desperately trying to catch up with what his mind was telling it to do. His breaths were shallow, ragged, but he tried to force his body to sit up, to get control of something, anything, before he lost it all. But it was no use. His body didn't respond. "Valeria," he whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp. His eyes fluttered open for just a moment, seeing the blurred outline of her face on the other side of the ship's window. She was watching him, concern etched into every line of her face. "Avon," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Stay with me. You've got this." But the words didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. His limbs were heavy, his heart pounding with an irregular, sickening beat. It felt like he was no longer fully present in his body. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it was just his mind, spiraling into the abyss. Maybe everything had already happened, and he was just too far gone to understand it. He reached out, weakly, his hand trembling as he tried to touch the screen in front of him. A few stray particles of antimatter buzzed at the edges of his fingertips, and he felt them, warm and heavy, but they weren't his. He was a conduit, nothing more. The power was slipping away from him, leaving him bare and exposed, a shell without a purpose. "Valeria," he tried again, but the word came out as little more than a breath. "Data. The data. You've got it, right?" Her face flickered with recognition, and for a moment, a shadow of hope crossed her expression. "Yes, Avon. We've got it. You did it. You saved us." The relief in her voice didn't match the deep ache that now settled in his chest. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to feel the victory, the satisfaction of having succeeded, but it was all slipping away, lost in the haze of his failing body. "Avon," Valeria repeated, her voice more insistent now. "Listen to me. We're going to get you back. You're going to be fine. We're going to get you back to Earth." But Avon knew better. The Earth, his home, those were all just distant memories now. There was nothing he could do to stop it. His body was dying, and no matter how much he wanted to fight, he was past the point of no return. He could feel it in the way his heartbeat faltered, in the way his breath came slower and more erratic. He had spent so much time fighting against the inevitable, fighting to control something that was always meant to break him down, and now there was nothing left but the pull of gravity's final embrace. The pain intensified, and with it came the disorienting sensation that time itself had become fluid. Seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes collapsed into seconds. Avon was floating somewhere in between, his body no longer tethered to the physical world. It was just him now, alone with his thoughts. Images flickered through his mind, memories of his childhood, his days as a scientist, the experiments that had begun this entire journey. The faces of his family, his colleagues, and the long nights spent in his lab, chasing the unknown. He could feel their warmth, their laughter, their voices all fading like the last embers of a dying fire. He hadn't lived a perfect life, but he had lived it. He had made a difference. He had meant something, but now, that was all gone. He had become a part of the very thing that had almost claimed him, the antimatter, the black hole, the very forces that had been beyond his control. It had been a gamble from the beginning, one that he had been willing to take. Maybe it was just the scientist in him, the endless curiosity that pushed him to seek answers. Or maybe it was something more, something about the way he had always pushed the boundaries of what was possible. A soft, distant voice broke through his fading thoughts. Valeria again, her voice cutting through the fog. "Avon, stay with me. Please, stay with me." But even as she spoke, Avon felt his connection to the world around him slipping. It wasn't that he couldn't hear her. He could hear her perfectly, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as if it was coming from another place entirely. His body felt light now, as though it no longer belonged to him, drifting away like particles in space. He couldn't fight it anymore. The next moment was a blur, a series of indistinct flashes, sounds, and sensations. He felt himself falling, his body weightless, suspended in the void. There was no black hole anymore, no pull, no gravity. He was no longer inside a ship or even inside his own body. He was just floating. Then there was nothing. It was hard to say exactly when the shift occurred. One moment, everything had been silent and still, and the next, there was a sense of movement, of time pressing forward once again. But Avon wasn't sure where he was or what was happening anymore. All he knew was that he was somewhere far away from everything, far away from the pain, from the desperation, from the antimatter. There was no pressure, no weight, no distortion. Just a quiet peace, as though time itself had finally taken a break. He opened his eyes, slowly, cautiously, as if waking from a dream. The first thing he saw was light, bright, comforting light. And then, a face. Familiar. Warm. Concerned. "Avon," Valeria's voice was soft, gentle, like the first breath of dawn after a long night. "You're alive." Avon blinked, disoriented, as the reality of the situation began to seep in. He was no longer in the black hole. He was back, somehow, impossibly, he was back. His body wasn't falling apart anymore. There were no cracks in his skin, no gnawing ache in his chest. He was alive, breathing, whole again. Valeria was sitting beside him, her expression one of disbelief and awe. Her hand rested gently on his, a connection that grounded him back to the world. "You did it," she repeated, almost in a whisper. "We made it back." Avon sat up slowly, feeling a rush of dizziness. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion. There was a depth to the weariness, a soul-deep tiredness that came from knowing he had come far too close to death, to never seeing the stars again. "I didn't think I would," Avon muttered, his voice weak. "I didn't think I could." Valeria smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. You're a miracle. A living, breathing miracle. Avon turned his head, looking out the window, seeing the distant stars twinkling in the dark expanse of space. He could feel the hum of the ship's engines beneath him, but it all felt so surreal. How had he made it back? Had it all been a dream? Or was it something more? The data was safe. The crew was safe. And he was alive, somehow. The black hole, the antimatter, the battle within himself, it was all behind him now, but Avon knew one thing for certain: the universe had just gotten a little bit bigger. And somehow, he was still part of it.